The Great Depression and the New Deal. Lesson 4. The New Deal expands. Analyze ways that the New Deal promoted social and economic reform and its long-term effects. Explain how New Deal legislation affected the growth of organized labor. And evaluate the impact of Roosevelt's plan to increase the number of U.S. Supreme Court justices on the course of the New Deal. Expanding New Deal programs. FDR's goal for the first phases of New Deal were relief, recovery, and reform. Progress had been made, but there still was a long way to go. Beginning in 1935, Roosevelt launched an aggressive campaign to find solutions to the ongoing problems caused by the Great Depression. This campaign, sometimes known as the Second New Deal, created Social Security and other programs that continue to have a profound impact on the everyday lives of Americans. You can pause the video and take a look at this graph and analyze how, in general, the relationship between the minimum wage and the real minimum wage changed over the past 40 years. Using the graph, how can you explain this change? You can pause the video and, using this graph, explain how Roosevelt's cutback on federal spending in 1937 affected the unemployment rate. How did John Maynard Keynes' theory of pump priming argue? Or rather, what did John Maynard Keynes' theory of pump priming argue? Deficit spending would stimulate the economy and end the Depression. What was the purpose of the Congress of Industrial Organizations? To organize workers who were excluded from other unions. Section 5. Effects of the New Deal. Identify the social and political contributions of Eleanor Roosevelt, Frances Perkins, and other women involved in the New Deal programs. Explain how the New Deal expanded economic opportunities for racial and ethnic minorities. Analyze how the New Deal changed the shape of American party politics and lessened ethnic and social divisions, and evaluate the effect of the New Deal on the historic role of the federal government and Franklin D. Roosevelt on the presidency. Here's a photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt visiting an Ohio coal mine in one of her many trips around the country. Her outreach changed the role of the First Lady. After Eleanor, First Ladies were often expected to be deeply involved in the nation's affairs.
Eleanor Roosevelt was born in New York City in 1884. In 1905, she married Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a distant cousin. Her husband served as President of the United States from 1933 until 1945, leading the country through the Great Depression and World War II. At the same time, Eleanor became world famous for her humanitarian work and became a role model for women in politics and public affairs. While the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt gave many lectures, held 350 press conferences for female reporters only, and wrote a daily newspaper column. She also wrote several books, worked with young people and the underprivileged, and fought for equal rights for minority groups. Her husband died in 1945. Later that year, she became a delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. And in 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt was elected chairman of the UN's Human Rights Commission. She helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and served in the UN until 1951. 10 years later, in 1961, she returned to the UN's General Assembly. Later that year, President John F. Kennedy appointed her head of the Commission on the Status of Women. Eleanor Roosevelt died in 1960.
When the Depression hit, African American workers were often the first to lose their jobs. By 1934, the unemployment rate for African Americans was almost 50%, more than twice the national average. Eleanor Roosevelt and others urged the president to improve the situation of African Americans. The Roosevelt administration's many African American appointees, known as the Black Cabinet, advised the president on issues affecting African Americans. Mary McLeod Bethune is front and center. Attempting to improve the lives of Native Americans, the Roosevelt administration made major changes in long-standing policies. The 1887 Dawes Act had divided tribal lands into smaller plots. By the early 1930s, it was clear that the act had worsened the condition of the people it was designed to help. Of the original 138 million acres American Indians had owned in 1887, only 48 million remained in American Indian hands, and much of it was too arid to farm. The New Deal benefited Native Americans as well as other minority groups. It provided funds for the Navajo to open a new hospital in Fort Defiance, Arizona in 1938. It also encouraged, for the first time, the teaching of Native languages and Native culture. By the time he died in 1945, Roosevelt had been elected to 4 terms as president. His legendary political skills had united an unlikely alliance of Americans into a strong political force called the New Deal Coalition. This coalition brought together Southern whites, Northern blue-collar workers, especially those with immigrant roots, poor Midwestern farmers, and African Americans. We are going to make a country in which no one is left out, Franklin Roosevelt once told Francis Perkins. The many programs he enacted to realize this goal led to the rise in a welfare state in the United States, a government that assumes responsibility for providing for the welfare of children and the poor, elderly, sick, disabled, and unemployed. What did Eleanor Roosevelt's newspaper column promote? Equal justice for all Americans. Why did President Roosevelt refuse to support a federal anti-lynching law? D. He feared the Southern Democrats would turn against him and prevent him from passing other reforms. What policy did the Bureau of Indian Affairs pursue in the 1930s? It encouraged the practice of Native American customs and languages. How did voting patterns change during the 1930s? many African Americans began to vote Democrat in support of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Why did Roosevelt's presidency prompt the passage of the 22nd Amendment? His 4 election victories increased support for a restriction on the presidency to 2 consecutive terms.